The snow was falling hard, almost swallowing the beams of the headlights. It was December 1944, on a supply road behind the Ardennes forest. The jeep swayed through mud and packed snow as it crept toward a checkpoint ahead. The checkpoint had been thrown together with sandbags and wooden posts. A dim kerosene lantern rocked in the wind, throwing light on the guard's breath as it turned to white vapor and on the outline of the rifle held across his chest. A sergeant was driving. A second lieutenant sat in the passenger seat. Their U.S. Army uniforms were a bit worn but neat. The jeep rolled to a stop at the barrier. The sentry stepped forward and swept a flashlight across their faces, then across the white star on the hood. Everything looked fine. "Password?" the sentry asked. In the cold night his voice was tight. The lieutenant answered at once with the correct reply word, crisp with a hint of an East Coast accent. The sentry nodded, as if ready to wave them through. But in the brief second or two that followed, his gaze drifted to the back seat. Two more men sat there, wrapped in greatcoats, caps pulled low so their faces were hard to read. That instant of hesitation, some instinct he couldn't explain, kept his finger from leaving the trigger guard. He asked another question, not the prescribed challenge, but something about the most recent movement of the division headquarters they claimed to be with. A small detail only someone truly inside that organization would be likely to know. The lieutenant's answer still came smoothly, even with a trace of irritation at being questioned without cause. But in certain extreme situations, correctness that is too smooth carries its own scent of wrongness. Time seemed to congeal in the snow and dark. Let them pass, or detain them. Trust your ears and eyes, or trust the inexplicable chill rising along your spine. Later, many Allied soldiers who lived through that winter described moments like it, when the enemy could not only speak your language, but imitate your manner perfectly, and even knew the petty internal trivia of your army. The foundations you used to distinguish friend from foe, uniforms, passwords, documents, could fail in an instant. What confronted you then was a deeper fear. You could not prove who the man in front of you really was. That was exactly the effect Operation Greif was designed to create. It was not an invention of rumor. After the war, German personnel who planned and executed this disguised infiltration were brought before military courts. The surviving indexes to the trial records make it clear that the central issue was not whether they had used disguises. On that point there was almost no dispute, but a sharper question. On a battlefield, how far may a soldier's disguise go? Where precisely is the red line between a lawful ruse and a war crime? The case files would provide a cold, definitive echo for an invisible war fought in blizzards and suspicion. So why take the risk of designing such a complicated script? Was it only to slip a few dozen men and a few vehicles past a handful of checkpoints? No. Their aim was far larger and far more abstract. They did not want to destroy a particular bridge or a particular headquarters. They wanted the entire Allied rear area support system to become sick. The Ardennes battlefield itself was the perfect culture medium for this kind of virus. The German offensive came without warning. Allied lines were torn open at the start, and units from different commands, hurriedly moved, scattered and mixed, crowded onto a few winter roads. Encounters between unfamiliar formations were routine. Radio nets were noisy and chaotic. Everyone was keyed up. Under those conditions, identifying a friendly unit depended on a fragile set of shortcuts. Check vehicle markings, ask the password, confirm the general direction of travel. When that system worked, it was efficient, but once you injected it with the poison of distrust, it produced paralysis that multiplied. And distrust does not stay politely confined to the single moment that gave birth to it. A sentry who has been wrong once begins to read every hesitation as intent. A checkpoint that has been embarrassed becomes a checkpoint that overcompensates. Messages passed down the line become sharper, shorter, less patient. Exhaustion deepens it. Men who have not slept start to hear an accent where none exists, or to suspect the honest pause of a cold throat as a calculated delay. The warning about imposters adds a second job to every soldier's list. Not only to move supplies and hold ground, but to constantly re-verify the meaning of every uniform he sees. Imagine this. A checkpoint extends its inspection time from 30 seconds to 3 minutes after one suspicious contact. 10 vehicles back up behind it. Those 10 vehicles units arrive late to the front. The news of delays reaches headquarters and triggers worry about rear area traffic and more questions. Meanwhile, an alert, Germans in our uniforms, spreads like wildfire over radio, phone, and word of mouth. The next checkpoint grows twice as cautious, even openly hostile to every passing vehicle. The next convoy may be sent down the wrong fork because a road sign has been quietly turned. The cost of identifying each person begins to soar. As some veterans later said, you had to prove to everyone you met that you were you. A more sober historical appraisal suggests that the infiltration did, for a short period, intensify rear area nervous tension and make the already clogged traffic and command chain carry an extra heavy tax of suspicion. This was the true shape of disguise as a weapon. Its damage did not show up directly in casualty counts, but in systemic friction imposed on the enemy's organizational body. It consumed not bullets, but more precious resources, time, trust, and the certainty that allows rapid decision-making under pressure. When every checkpoint became a combination lock demanding repeated verification, and every friendly unit might need to be covertly examined, the efficiency of the entire military machine declined. The designers of this method also had to face a darker question that followed from it. Once suspicion reached a certain density, would a rifle muzzle, in panic and misunderstanding, swing toward friendly soldiers? And once that happened, the nature of the act would change, because the weapon would no longer be doubt alone. Chaos arrived on schedule. According to multiple post-war accounts, infiltration teams exploited the early confusion to create a series of faults that were not always lethal, but were far-reaching. Some quietly altered road signs at key intersections, sending an entire artillery battalion into a dead end when it urgently needed to reach its positions. Others impersonated military police at traffic hubs and issued false directions, rerouting convoys and worsening the jams. More often, they simply existed. They appeared in rear areas with plausible identities, observed, passed information, and moved on. Their successful existence by itself was like a stone tossed into water. It did not have to be large to start ripples, and those ripples of doubt widened on their own. The most typical scene was an upgraded version of that snow night checkpoint. A US-looking truck is stopped and questioned. The men aboard answer fluently. Their papers seem hard to fault. Yet the officer or sentry cannot shake his unease. He may demand everyone dismount for a closer inspection. He may insist on calling far back to some headquarters that might already be out of contact. The process can take 10 minutes, half an hour. The line of blocked vehicles grows longer. Complaints and anxiety accumulate in the cold. Eventually, perhaps for lack of proof, the disguised men are waved through. But what they leave behind is a checkpoint that is now more suspicious than before and likely to act more extremely the next time. The friction coefficient of the rear network rises quietly with each tense exchange. Yet all of this remained part of the game until the first shot was fired. The law of war draws a delicate line around disguise. In theory, the line is clear. On a battlefield of blood and panic, it blurs. One widely discussed principle is this: you may use ruses, but you may not commit perfidy. Wearing the enemy's uniform to pass a checkpoint, gather intelligence, even sabotage communications can, under some interpretations, fall into a dangerous yet arguable category of war ruse. But if you are still wearing that uniform, still benefiting from the protected assumptions it triggers, and you directly shoot the enemy, the nature of the act changes. That is commonly understood as perfidy. It abuses the protective meaning attached to the enemy's own symbols and breaks the minimum trust that the rules require to function at all. The uniform matters because it is not merely fabric. It is a public signal on a violent stage where people must make decisions in seconds. A sleeve patch, a helmet shape, a color and cut of cloth, the markings on a vehicle. They compress information into something the eye can grasp without deliberation. They say, without speeches, who is expected to fight, who may be taken prisoner, who may surrender, and who is entitled to the treatment reserved for captured combatants. Most of the time, that shorthand keeps the battlefield from dissolving into pure guesswork. Soldiers can hate one another and still rely on the same basic code for what certain signs mean. That is why the distinction between ruse and perfidy is not a debate about manners. A ruse aims to mislead the enemy's operations without exploiting the enemy's willingness to follow protective rules. It tricks the mind while leaving the shared framework intact. Perfidy, by contrast, weaponizes the enemy's willingness to follow the framework. It turns rule-following into vulnerability. Once that happens, the damage spreads far beyond the immediate target. If a uniform can be used as bait for a killing, then every uniform becomes suspect. The battlefield becomes a place where surrender is no longer safe, where medical markings are no longer credible, where identification collapses. The law's fear is not only the death in front of you, it is the cascade that follows when the code is corrupted. In the ice and fog of the Ardennes, that theoretical boundary was battered again and again by reality. Some narratives claim that certain infiltration teams, when caught in sudden contact or when they believed exposure was imminent, chose to strike first, attacking while still dressed in American uniforms. Other accounts suggest they avoided direct firefights whenever possible to preserve the disguise. But regardless, once gunfire erupted from men wearing Allied uniforms, whether in self-defense or as an ambush, the episode slid with an almost mechanical inevitability from tactics and psychology into law and moral judgment. The gunfire was not only a tactical conclusion, it was a bright searchlight that dragged disguised men from the grey of war's improvisations into another arena, where their fate would be weighed in manuals, testimonies, and the judge's insistence on lines. Cold has a smell. In December 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest, it was a sharp mix of pine needles, snow powder, and diesel exhaust. Late at night, on a bend in a rear area supply road, a temporary checkpoint stood. Two hissing kerosene lamps carved a circle of pallid light out of heavy darkness. At the edge of that light, snow fell in a slanting hush. A standard-issue US Jeep came out of the road's far end, its headlights cutting two wavering pillars through the snowfall. The engine note grew louder and then softened as it slowed at the barrier. It stopped. The motor idled. The exhaust coughed white clouds into the air. Behind the wheel sat a soldier in an M43 field jacket that looked a size too large, steel helmet pulled low. The passenger and the men in back were curled inward, faces hard to make out in shadow. The sentry, a young corporal named Harold, tightened his grip on his M1 Garand. His fingers were stiff with cold, but his nerves were drawn tight as wire. For the last 48 hours, the warning had spread through the entire rear. Germans were dressing as Americans. They might speak fluent English, carry papers forged to perfection, even drive captured or copied American vehicles. "Password!" Harold shouted. In the stillness of the snowy night, it sounded abrupt. His partner, another guard, shifted his position, muzzle subtly aligned toward the jeep. The driver lifted his head. Under the helmet, the lamplight caught his face in alternating bands of shadow and pale. He paused for a second, maybe clearing his throat, maybe nothing more than a natural delay. "Lightning," he said. His voice was steady, with a drawl that might have been Midwestern. "Reply?" Harold pressed. Procedure demanded it. "Thunder." The answer came fast, almost without hesitation. The password matched. Perfectly. Harold should have waved them on. But something held him. Was it a barely perceptible tension inside that steady tone? The way the passenger kept angling away from the light, refusing to meet it? The timing and location of this jeep, faintly overlapping with some suspicious activity area that headquarters had flagged? There was no hard evidence, only a cold, skin-crawling intuition that everything right in front of him might be the biggest wrong of all. He took 2 steps closer. Snow creaked under his boots. "What unit are you with? Where are you headed this late?" The driver seemed to inhale slightly, and Harold caught the motion. 28th Infantry Division, buddy. Comms went bad. We're going forward to take a look. still smooth, still plausible. Yet, 28th rang a bell. Harold thought he'd heard movement orders earlier in the day, orders that suggested they weren't in this sector. Or maybe he was misremembering. In the Ardennes, on that vast, chaotic chessboard, unit movements bubbled like air in boiling water. No one could be sure. For a few seconds time froze in the hard air. The jeep engine continued to idle like an impatient animal. In the back seat someone shifted, perhaps only adjusting his posture. Harold's hand rested on the forend of his rifle. Despite the sub-zero temperature, sweat dampened his palm. He faced a choice. Detain these own men on instinct and risk a disastrous mistake, delaying something urgent. Or let them pass and gamble on a faint possibility that they were, in fact, the enemy. If he held them, he had to justify it. Not to an abstract rulebook, but to angry drivers behind them, to the men in the jeep, to his own superior who was already flooded with calls. He would have to turn suspicion into procedure, order them out, search them, call someone for verification that might never come. He would have to watch their hands, listen to their answers, and decide whether a voice that sounded right was right. If he let them go, he would have to live with the possibility that he had opened a door behind his own lines. The cost of being wrong ran in two directions, and both costs were personal. Harold had also heard that the measures were changing by the hour. Passwords were no longer enough. Passwords could be captured, repeated, rehearsed. Men were beginning to test one another with questions that sat outside formal procedure but inside cultural muscle memory. The kind of thing a real American soldier might answer without thinking, and an outsider might answer too smoothly, too cautiously, or not at all. It could be a baseball team from back home, a remark about a radio show, a bit of slang a drill sergeant used so often it became a reflex. It was not fair and it was not clean, and it turned camaraderie into interrogation, but it was also an attempt to buy certainty with whatever coin was available, even if that coin was private trivia that had no place in a war. In the kerosene light, even that privacy felt fragile. Harold hated what it implied, that the uniform on a man's body might mean less than the tiniest test of accent and familiarity, as if the war had narrowed to the width of his own ear. This was not an isolated dilemma. In the winter of 1944, behind the sudden German surge of the Ardennes counter-offensive, countless Allied soldiers, especially rear area guards, MPs, signalmen, found themselves living through the same collapse of trust. The enemy no longer came only from a clear line of battle. He might wear your same olive drab, speak your language, hold papers that looked legitimate, and step out from behind you. This special infiltration campaign, later called Operation Greif, did not need to win firefights to be effective. It needed to make people second-guess what had previously been automatic. And when the battle's noise finally fell away, the story did not end. A number of captured participants were brought before military courts after the war. The surviving indexes of those proceedings show the prosecutorial focus with stark clarity. Not whether these men fought bravely or cleverly, but a cold professional dispute. In combat conditions, where exactly is the legal boundary of wearing the enemy's uniform? The court was not judging victory or defeat, it was judging rules. So return to that checkpoint in the snow. How could only a few dozen, perhaps a few hundred, disguised infiltrators trigger such wide suspicion across the massive Allied rear? Was their aim really no more than passing a few inspection points and causing a few small disruptions? No, their ambition ran deeper. The early conditions of the Ardennes battle were a perfect breeding ground for a disguise virus. Under sudden pressure, the Allies fell back and reorganized. Units were shattered, mixed and remade. Unfamiliar faces filled every road and every headquarters. Rear area lines were jammed with hurried troop movements, retreating stragglers and arriving reinforcements. Under that load, standard identity checks, glancing at unit patches, demanding the password, examining papers, were already strained. Efficiency and security became a trade, and the trade was not voluntary. Operation Greif's designers sensed the system's fragility. They did not invest in conventional commando raids so much as in seeds of doubt. According to veteran recollections and later narratives, Infiltration groups were often instructed not to seize a key bridge, but to manufacture confusion, rotate road signs and send convoys to the wrong place, impersonate military police at traffic hubs and claim authority, issuing false directions, approach communications nodes or command vehicles, and inject false information that sounded urgent and professional enough to be obeyed. In that environment, the fear of being fooled did not remain a rear area story. It leaked forward into every decision. A commander receiving a delayed report could no longer assume delay meant weather or congestion. He had to consider sabotage, and then consider the possibility that the warning about sabotage was itself another kind of sabotage. The mind begins to loop. Every decision sprouts a shadow question, and every shadow question burns time. Fatigue compounds it. Men who have not slept well begin to treat uncertainty as evidence. A slow response becomes suspicious. A fast response becomes suspicious. A unit that looks unfamiliar becomes suspicious. The system begins to spend its energy not on movement, but on verification. Each successful misdirection, each extra inspection, drained two rear area resources that were already scarce: time and trust. Worse, doubt reproduced itself. When one checkpoint intercepted infiltrators and earned praise, others leaned towards stricter, slower checks, even at the cost of crippling traffic. When radio nets filled with warnings about imposters, any unfamiliar unit drew exaggerated suspicion. Some historians have described the rear area atmosphere as sliding, in places, into a state of mutual apprehension. You did not only have to prove you were a soldier, you had to prove you were the right kind of soldier. That leads to the tactical point that became the legal focus later: armed contact. Wearing the enemy's uniform for reconnaissance, sabotage, and misdirection might still be argued as falling into a grey zone of war ruse, but what if you fire while wearing it? War's chaos does not allow theory a clean laboratory. According to some war histories and post-war statements, infiltration teams inevitably found moments they could not bluff through. Maybe a hyper-alert checkpoint grew too suspicious. Maybe they collided with a patrol while carrying out sabotage. Maybe a more aggressive order arrived. Then, the decisive moment came. A disguised man yanked an MP-40 submachine gun from beneath the Jeep's canvas or pulled a Luger pistol from inside the oversized American jacket. Once shots were fired, the disguise shifted from strategy to event. For the Allied soldiers in contact, it meant deception was over and direct fighting had begun. But for the post-war court, that gunfire became a legal watershed. It posed a precise question: does attacking while wearing the enemy's uniform exceed the permissible range of war ruse and constitute perfidy? A war crime? Step away from the smoky Ardennes road and picture a different place. The courtroom after the war. No snow, no cordite, only heavy oak tables, towering stacks of documents, and a different kind of tension. Here, the battleground is terminology. The prosecution and the defense are not fighting for a hill. They are fighting for an interpretation of minutes. They are trying to arrange the same fragments into different chains of meaning, because in law, the chain is what turns facts into judgment. A prosecutor stands and points to a specific incident. A disguised team at some road junction ambushed an American transport column while still not revealing German identity. He cites customary rules of war and argues that using enemy insignia and uniforms to obtain trust and then attack is prohibited because it destroys the minimum foundation of mutual confidence that makes surrender signals, medical markings, and even basic identification possible. If that is not punished, he warns, future battlefields will become places where no one dares believe a raised hand, a spoken surrender, or a marked vehicle. The result would not be cleverness. It would be a slide toward war without brakes. But the prosecutor's strongest claim is not outrage. It is functional. He argues that a uniform is a promise enforced by shared expectation. You do not have to like the man in it. You do not have to believe his cause. You only have to recognize that certain rules have attached to him in a particular way so that violence does not become pure predation. His case tries to show that the uniform did not merely help infiltrators move. It helped them get close under a protective assumption. And that protective assumption is precisely what perfidy forbids you to exploit for killing. The defense answers by pulling the court's imagination back into the freezing, chaotic Ardennes of December 1944. They concede the men wore American uniforms, but argue this was necessary disguise for deep infiltration, intended primarily for penetration, reconnaissance, and disruption, not for perfidious killing of individual soldiers. They describe a team operating behind enemy lines, like men walking on a knife edge, where exposure meant death. When contact occurred, they claim, firing was often a split-second reflex in self-defense or in a desperate attempt to escape once challenged. They ask how a court can demand that, in the instant before a firefight, a soldier perform a ritual of removing a borrowed jacket and announcing his identity, as if war pauses to let law catch up. This is where the case turns on geometry, not merely whether shots were fired, but when. Not merely whether a uniform was worn, but how it functioned at the moment violence began. The prosecution wants the chain to read. Uniform creates trust. Trust enables proximity. Proximity enables attack. The defense wants the chain to read. Uniform enables movement. Movement fails. Exposure creates panic. Panic forces a fight. Both sides know that in law, sequence is a kind of proof. If the disguise is the lever that makes the killing possible, the act looks like betrayal. If the disguise is only a failing cover in a chaotic encounter, the act looks like combat. The argument, in other words, is not whether deception existed. Deception is assumed. The question is what the deception was allowed to do. In the language of the court, everything becomes a timeline. How close did the disguised men get before violence? Were they still presenting themselves as American when they fired, or had the disguise already been shed in a meaningful way? Did the uniform function as a shield that bought them a protected approach, or was it simply clothing they had not yet had the chance to remove? This is why the case files read like an effort to measure seconds. In those seconds is the difference the law claims to recognize, the point where it separates a permitted ruse from a forbidden betrayal. So the judges have to do what the battlefield refused to do: slow down time. They examine evidence with care. What did the orders actually say? Avoid contact wherever possible or clear obstacles by force. How did a firefight begin? Did the infiltrators set an ambush, or were they forced to shoot first to escape once challenged? At the moment shots were fired, was the enemy uniform the primary tool of the attack, or merely a background condition that could not be changed in time? Even the facts themselves are not always clean. Witnesses remember snow, darkness, bursts of confusion, voices shouting in English, the sudden realization that what looked like friendly movement was not. Reports were written in haste. Later, memories hardened around fear and rumor. The court, working after the gunfire, has to translate that chaos into categories. It has to decide which details are reliable, which have drifted, and which details matter because they point to intent. It has to do, with paper and testimony, what Harold could not do under kerosene light. Decide whether suspicion was justified. Some defense arguments touch an even more controversial point: military necessity. In an effort to reverse German disadvantage in the Ardennes, any means that could delay and disrupt Allied rear operations was treated as justifiable. Wearing enemy uniforms was the only effective method to achieve that tactical aim. Can military necessity, even in part, excuse such conduct? The answer cannot be a blank check. If necessity could wash away perfidy, then any future force could claim necessity and strip every protective symbol of meaning until surrender and prisoner treatment become impossible. The court's problem is that it must acknowledge war's pressures without allowing pressure to erase the very idea of a limit. Every sentence in that courtroom tries to place a clearer tick mark on the blurred red line. The process matters beyond any single guilty or not guilty verdict. It is a public, meticulous review meant to tell future soldiers, even under the most extreme stress of war, some acts remain beyond what civilized society will accept. It seeks to answer a fundamental question. For victory, how far are we willing to allow ourselves to become the enemy? When the court delivers its judgment, whether it finds that certain acts crossed the line into war crimes, or that evidence did not prove perfidy, or that the complexity of circumstances demanded leniency, The meaning goes beyond the individuals. The judgment becomes a legal clarification and a reaffirmation of values. It confirms the existence and seriousness of the perfidy principle, and it exposes how difficult it can be to apply that principle to real cases. It is like a boundary marker. It cannot map every inch, but it insists the boundary exists. So in purely military terms, how successful was Operation Greif? Can its results be measured cleanly? Historians tend to judge it with caution and multiple lenses. There is little doubt it caused real, short-term local confusion and psychological shock. Many Allied memoirs and wartime reports mention that rear area tension intensified under the infiltration threat. Checkpoints became more vigilant, producing traffic delays. Trust between unfamiliar units fell, increasing friction in coordination. Headquarters had to issue repeated alerts and update passwords, scattering attention. One historian compared it to sand thrown into a set of gears. It did not stop the machine, but it made the machine grind. Yet most research concludes its decisive impact on the overall strategic course of the Ardennes battle was limited. The German offensive ultimately failed due to broader disadvantages in manpower, equipment, logistics, and air power, factors that a handful of infiltration teams could not reverse. The trust crisis and confusion were real, but the Allied system showed considerable resilience and adaptability. As security measures tightened, passwords changed frequently, and challenges began to include details only genuine American soldiers were likely to know, the chaos became more manageable, though not without cost. So, the most accurate description may be that Operation Greif did not change the battle so much as grind against it. It succeeded, for a limited time, in raising the transaction costs of Allied rear operations. Every extra minute spent verifying identity, every detour driven because of suspicion, every emergency response launched because of a false report. Together, these added up to a meaningful expenditure. The cost could not be counted like tanks destroyed, but it drew down time, attention, and psychological endurance. In a few places, the tension reportedly spilled into overreaction, including brief exchanges of fire between anxious Allied troops when a password response was slow or a voice sounded wrong. Whether or not each story was precisely recorded, the possibility itself was part of the weapon. The fear that mistakes would be made not because of enemy fire, but because the code of recognition had been poisoned. In the end, after arguments over tactics and legal clauses receded into archives, what this story leaves behind is a more basic thought. The most expensive and most fragile thing in war is certainty. That brief hesitation at the snowy checkpoint, the one Harold felt, was a micro moment of certainty collapsing. His training and the rules he relied on, passwords, uniforms, papers, suddenly became unreliable under a carefully constructed deception. He was forced in an instant to use intuition and conscience to carry the weight of identifying friend or foe. And Operation Greif was nothing more than an attempt to turn countless such moments from possibility into lived reality. The post-war trials were society's effort to stitch that torn certainty back together with reason and rule. They tried to declare that even where lying can be used as a weapon, there are limits. Those limits protect not abstract morality alone, but the last logic that prevents war from becoming pure massacre. The possibility of identifying sides, the safety of surrender, and basic respect for certain markers, such as medical insignia. The boundary of disguise, then, has never been only a technical matter of military craft or legal doctrine. It is the fragment of shared agreement about credibility and rule that civilization tries to preserve under war's most extreme pressure test. Each challenge and each reaffirmation of that boundary, whether in the Ardennes in 1944 or in later conflicts, redefines how, when we fall into violence, we choose to retain something that makes a peace afterward possible. The recognition of minimal common rules. Operation Greif and its subsequent trials were like a stone dropped into history's river. The tactical ripples have long since smoothed out. The battle's verdict is fixed. But the red line the courtroom struggled to describe between ruse and perfidy remains as a warning. It reminds soldiers, and anyone who studies war and peace, that the most powerful weapon is not always the sharpest blade, but a lie capable of corroding trust. and that the strongest defense is not only steel and firepower, but a shared commitment to the fragile rules that keep war from devouring every possibility of recognition.